Can I honestly say that I have grown up spiritually? How would I even be able to tell if I had? Early stage development and vulnerabilities help us literally to make sense of our small world and our small self. In childhood, we tend to think you get what you deserve. You don't deserve anything more than what you earned, and therefore are worthy of receiving. It is a simple worldview that expects bad people to be punished and good people to be rewarded. It is how we see justice done. Unfortunately, that's still the world many of us inhabit. Because our world and business or in the universities around us are all about performance and about networking and about testing and about kissing up. Across that street, it's all about achievement. And so we think like 9-year-olds about how we expect this world to work. We think like 9-year-olds about morality and justice. And we never grow up spiritually. Ours is a quid pro quo consciousness. We think, do they deserve this? But God does not ask that question ever. Now, the bad news is that God does not even ask that question of those bad people in the world who cause me so much harm and damage. But the good news is God doesn't even ask that of you. God will not ask you today or in the end if you deserve heaven or any other good thing. God's not going to ask you that. So be relieved. I find myself, frankly, quite relieved that God is not going to say today or in the end, Gary, do you deserve this heaven? But I'm not quite so relieved that God's not going to ask my enemies if they deserve heaven. I kind of want God to ask them that. If we as adults now, at least in our bodies, are ever going to break out of this mindset, this way of thinking, this worldview, God is going to have to change a lot in us. God's going to have to change us by inserting some sort of new and wonderful software into our brains. And that is exactly what God is doing this morning. That is exactly what God is trying to do in the teachings of this mystic Jesus. We have to be more than moral. More than moral. If we want to grow spiritually, we have to become mystics. Mystics are people who seek union with God and all people and all things, always. Mystics know union. If we want to be mystics, we will have to develop an alternative consciousness, an alternative way of thinking to the way most of us live most of our lives, day in and day out. And our early notions of moral explanations, they have to fall apart. They have to fall apart if we are ever, you and I, to walk the mystical path, the path of union, the next step in our spiritual development. Now I got to tell you, if you're not ready and willing to inhabit this new world that we in the church call the kingdom of God, the reign of God, the world as God would have it, then why don't you start by not praying the Our Father here? Because every time you say, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is done in heaven," every time you pray that prayer, you're praying that that new world literally break into your little world, the world you live in day in and day out, all the time, the world you're mostly conscious of and its ways. But in God's world, God's love can never be deserved, ever. In God's world, love will always, always be free, unmeritable, and undeserved. God is beyond justice, the way you and I think of justice. My friends, this message is so important. It's so important that Jesus himself teaches it again and again and again, and he shows it to us. He demonstrates it in his skin, the way he lived and the way he died. You can see it in his teaching, even in the story you just heard proclaimed in the gospel this morning. These laborers agree to a salary, and they get hired for a certain pay for their work that day, all that day. But lo and behold, the boss needs more help as the day progresses. So he goes out and he finds extras to come help finish the job. Now the laborers are making $200 for that day's work, and they agreed to work 10 hours that day for those $200. But lo and behold, they find out that these guys are also getting paid $200 for their work that day. But they only had to work 3 hours. The laborers are furious. "This is not fair," they cry. "This is unjust." And the boss's response to them, in the name of God, he says it, "Hey, I'm just a generous guy. This is who I am. I am generous. I am merciful. This is who I am. You figure out the rest." I'm a generous God. This is who I am. I'm being true to myself. You figure out the rest. Tell me, are they right, the laborers? Is this fair? Is this justice? No. At least no, not in the worldview of a 9-year-old. But the kicker comes to us in the words of the prophet Isaiah in the first reading, who wags that bony prophetic finger at us and says, "God's ways are not your ways." God's ways are not your ways. This is not a generosity, my friends, that we can wrap our brains around. Jesus tells us the same thing when he tells the story, another story called the prodigal son. When the older brother gets so resentful, that his younger brother got the feast, got the father's attention, and got the welcome he did after turning his back on his family and squandering his life. He too said, "This is not fair, this is not justice." He'd been working his tail off the whole time His brother was out there squandering everything. Don't you hate it when that happens? Not only does Jesus teach it, He shows it to us. He shows it to us. He shows it by welcoming always around Himself in His inner circle, welcoming the liars and the cheats and the money grabbers and the prostitute and the thieves, even at their last-minute conversion. To the thief on his right, who likely lived his whole life stealing. At his last breath, he turns to Jesus and says, essentially, I'm sorry. And Jesus says to him, today. He didn't say, what did you do with the rest of your life? He didn't say, do you measure up? Have you achieved? He doesn't say any of that. He just says, today you will be with me in paradise. And even to the people who were killing him, an innocent man in his own agony, turned to them and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. We don't think like this. Because Jesus was true to who He was, which is God for us. And God is just generous and always, always, always merciful. Do you remember John Wayne? You guys at this Mass might know him a little better than the students will tonight. John Wayne, what a character, what a human being. I call it the John Wayne phenomena. This man lived in some ways a dissolute life, in some ways. He was married 3 times, divorced 3 times, lived with his secretary when it came time to die. He'd had numerous affairs, was a heavy, heavy drinker. But practically on his deathbed, he was on his deathbed literally, and there in that last few breaths of his life, he asked to become Catholic. And so they called the priest, and the priest came down, received him into the church. And later on that day, he died. Guess what the reaction of many Catholics was to that? I'm telling you, this is not fair. I've lived my whole life trying to be faithful to my spouse. I've gone to Mass every Sunday for 70 years. I pray the rosary. I try to do everything right and moral. And here comes this jerk at the very last minute converting and going, wah. Just like the good thief. Huh? Exactly like the good thief. And when Catholics get upset, I can just hear God saying to them, you know, I'm just being who I am. I'm merciful, and so I will be merciful always. I am forgiving, I am faithful, and my love doesn't stop with sin even. Can you begin to see with me how important this is to Jesus, that we begin to get this? Again, it's not how we tend to think, and it's certainly not the world we live in day out. But it's so important that to Jesus that we begin to get this. He's essentially saying to us, I want you now, at this point in your development, I want you to live in this reality in your world. At least try. You will be a different person, I promise you, if you live this way. And it will turn your world, the people around you, your immediate world, upside down. Upside down, really. Can I just tell you how much comfort and solace it gives me to see now from where I stand in my life, that we live in a universe that is so generous and so merciful and so always generative of new life. Can I just tell you what it is like? What it might feel like to know that this insane, irrational, unmeritable love runs the world underneath it all and through it all? And that this mercy just keeps coming to me and I can't stop it. I don't want that only the rare and the few get this. And I certainly don't want us to be the last ones to get it. I want you to know this in your bones, this new world, this new way of thinking. God's ways are not our ways. They're not our ways. And for that, I could not be more grateful. Given how different the thinking of Jesus is from the worlds you and I inhabit, I'd like to suggest to you, and it's one of the things I savor about this hour with you at the beginning of this new week. In this hour, it becomes hugely important and necessary for us to grow. Because here, at least, here, and it's always true here, our achievements, our successes, our upright behavior do not mean diddly squat to God. Here, we are welcome. Welcome. And you'll find yourself actually saying it in this hour at the beginning of a new week. Just before you receive that greatest of gifts, God's own life in Holy Communion, you actually say this. You actually honor how tremendously unworthy you are of this gift of life that comes to you no matter what you've done, how utterly undeserving. Lord, I'm not worthy to receive you. I'm not worthy. I'm not deserving of this gift of yourself. It's probably the most honest part of the whole Mass. It's partly why it's so hard to accept. Here is where you know you are loved as you are and acceptable to God and forgiven. In this hour at least, of all the hours of the week that comes, in this 1 hour, we are actually living in an alternative reality. It is good to be here. You have grown so much over the years. I know you, if not individually, I know you as a community. I know you, my friends. And you are ready for this. You are ready to hear this. You are ready to receive this. As a matter of fact, I would say you're more ready than you've ever been in your life.